Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonicist. Welcome, folks. Welcome to the 150th episode of the Napoleonicist. Welcome to the 175,000th download special. And welcome, as my guest said before we started recording, to the Terror. Yes, we are doing an episode that actually in this case isn't one that's fallen out of my head. It was requested by one of my Patreon supporters. We are looking at Napoleonic France and questioning, was it a state of terror? I'm just going to let you kind of pause and absorb the scope of kind of double meanings and double entendres there in a very ham-fisted show title. Joining me to unpick this, well, we had to go for one of your favorites, didn't we? The recent lineup has been an all-star cast. We've got to keep the high quality going for you guys. So I have Distinguished Professor of the History of International Relations at Utrecht University, author of Fighting Terror After Napoleon, How Europe Became Secure After 1815, which I should say was the recipient of a very prestigious prize this year, the Duke d'Arenberg Prize, for the best book on European history. Also co-editor of Securing Europe After Napoleon, regular contributor to the Napoleonicist, all-round lovely individual. Beatrice de Graaf is back in the house and today is going to enlighten us all on the topic that really is her bread and butter, terror, during this period. I'm going to look at the Napoleonic regime as a way of trying to unpick this. Welcome back, Beatrice. Great to see you again. How are you doing?
Thank you, Zach. So happy to be here and talk about one of my favorite topics, the terror.
Yeah, you did say in a sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek way that your life is all about the terror and you love the terror, which I feel we need to kind of just contextualize because that's not to imply that Beatrice is a psychopath by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that this is what she does. This is her expertise. So please don't think that I've got some kind of raving loon on the show this afternoon. That is not the case. We're talking about context. Let's pack some context into this because, full disclosure, in fact, somebody criticized me for this the other day. I bash Napoleon on this podcast. You might have noticed. That's not a case of me telling you what to think, as somebody suggested. That's merely a case of me presenting the facts as I see them. But that to one side. We often, me, others, bash Napoleon for the police state under his regime. And yet, this wasn't unique to him. This was a kind of unknown phenomenon. So prior to the revolution, how did the secret police and state censorship work in France?
Yes, thank you for that question. And that really is a great debate and a very wide debate to tap into, because there's different schools of thought on the continuities of the terror between the terror regime by Robespierre and the subsequent revolutionary regimes, and then over to Napoleon. So there's a whole debate there. Then there is another debate which says, well, the terror wasn't so novel to the French Revolution as such, neither to Napoleon, but it was already institutionalized, and it was already there in place under Louis XVI and the Bourbon government. So, and there's quite some discussion, quite some gaps there also in the research, because on the one hand you have researchers like Lynn Hunt and François Furet, a very important French historian, and they make the case that it was, well, it's the classic argument that it was the war that brutalized the revolutionaries. They felt beleaguered from all sides. It was internal dynamics under the pressure of the war that brought about the terror, and it wasn't there from the beginning. There's others like Timothy Tackett who say, well, no, not so much. It was something that the revolutionaries sort of copied from the Bourbon regime, and they copied it because the Bourbon regime actually already unleashed terror against them, not with the big capital terror, but it was a regime based on a court police, and this court police was completely unaccountable. It only accounted for its deeds vis-a-vis the king himself, Louis. Then you had other types of maréchaussée, which were already in place as well. And for example, there's an excellent article written by Simon Burroughs in English, who demonstrated that French secret agents, officials from the secret police, were dispatched not just in France, but also to London, for example, to kill and maim and poison French exile revolutionaries. So they were right in feeling that they themselves had been terrorized. So there's more continuation between Louis XVI regime, the Bourbon regime, than the revolutionary regime and Napoleonic regime than we perhaps may think. So I have to admit that I'm more in the Timothy Tackett camp than in the Lynn Hunt, François Furet camp.
Just to be really awkward, I kind of like both. I'm sitting on the fence here. I can see sort of elements of both, in the sense that you can understand how the revolutionary regime would have in time transitioned towards greater use of terror. As we know, it kind of descends this slippery slope of increasing radicalization. But that's not to say that in having this kind of situation, not quite forced upon them, but in kind of undergoing this transition, that doesn't mean that they can't then pick up the apparatus that has gone before. This idea that everything is completely new and radical, I've never really kind of bought that. And this is one of the things that I think is going to come out quite strongly from this episode, that actually what Napoleon's doing, perhaps, and this is my gut, isn't a million miles away from either what's gone before or what other nations are doing. So we'll pause on that question and kind of unpick that in a bit. But I kind of see, I'm going to sit on the fence and say I see a route to incorporate both into one. There we go. That's the White thesis.
That's a great starting position. Sitting on a fence is never a very stable position. So let me try and push you over to one side, Zach. About Napoleon and what came before him, well, there is this very performative, very demonstrative moment of terror, which the Allied powers and the foreign powers who waged war against Napoleon held very strongly against him. And it was not so much that he started the war as such, but it was the murder of the Duc d'Enghien. Don't know if you remember this. The Duc d'Enghien was murdered on the 8th of February 1804, and he was kidnapped. He was residing just out of France, and Napoleon thought that he was going to topple him, 1804, just before he had made himself an emperor, and he felt that the last prince of the Condé, which d'Enghien was, that he was about to enter France on a mission to stage a coup. So what Napoleon did was, you could say, a preemptive strike. He sent his secret agents. They kidnapped Duc d'Enghien, and he was hauled into France, and there in the fortress of Vincennes, which still is, by the way, the military archive of France nowadays, if you go there, and he was shot by a firing squad in the middle of the night, I think, or in a day, I'm not sure, at least in 1804. The thing is that for the Allied powers, this was not just routine. This was not just a military act. It was outside of the military affairs. It was an execution which was not upheld by any legal procedure of legal process. And for Napoleon, it was just a revenge act. But for the others, for the outsiders, it put Napoleon outside the pale of civilization. And this is something that explicitly was held against him in 1815, in March 1815, and the Treaty of Mutual Security was concluded between the powers of the Seventh Coalition. And they said, well, perhaps not after France, but after Napoleon. He put himself outside the pale of civilization. And what he did was plain terror. And there's no international legal situation, law legitimizing this. This is part of the terror. And for Metternich, for example, this was another symptom of the widespread terror in France. So Metternich did not make a distinction between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette guillotined in Paris and the Duc d'Enghien by Napoleon shot before the firing squad. It was both still an example of that same terror. So I think you're right in that the tactics that were deployed and adopted by the revolutionary regime and Napoleon, they were on a par for the Allied powers. And at the same time, for them, this was something that you just didn't do. You just didn't put a Prince de Condé, a royal prince, for a firing squad. But then again, the question is, was this indeed something that set Napoleon apart from the previous regimes? And if we go back to Louis V, not the 16th, but the 5th, he did give his secret agents full credit and a carte blanche, a license to kill even, to go abroad and kill his oppositional libellists, as he called them. So the writers and the distributors of rumors and negative things about the royal house. So they were not even military opponents, but they were playwrights, politicians, lawyers, journalists that were put on a hit list by Louis V agent. So Napoleon would argue, well, I'm not so different from what Louis V did. I'm just trying to consolidate my reign and rule out and extinguish my opponents. So you see, I mean, okay, I now realize that I'm not really pushing you off the fence. I'm still making the case that you can see both continuity and discontinuity here. But I like the way these perceptions of such terror or hits, terrorist attacks, that's pretty much what it is. It was not in the framework of an ordinary war. It was not supported by a verdict by a judge. It was in peacetime an act of revenge or political terrorism against an opponent. But Louis V did that, and Napoleon did it as well, as did the revolutionaries.
Just a quick question: Louis V or Louis XV?
I'm very sorry, Louis XV.
Okay, I mean, the only reason that I ask is there are a lot of Louis in French history,
Yeah.
and as you're saying it, I'm thinking, is this going all the way back to Louis V?
No, sorry. It's just
don't worry.
I spoke German today, and then Dutch, and now English, and reading French, and I just misspelled it. It's Louis XV. Sorry.
Not at all. But just the way you just casually say. So earlier I was reading German. I've been speaking in Dutch. Now I'm speaking in English. I've also been reading French. It's not a flex, but just the mind-blowing ability to jump from language to language, because it's well known on this show and amongst the Twitter community that I can't speak English particularly well, let alone another language. And the abuse that I rightly get for failed attempts to use other tongues is profound and considerable, and as I say, completely justified.
Well, for me, numbers are always a tongue twister, so sorry for that.
There was a meme actually that went out on social media, which looked at how different nations say different numbers, and I think this one was something like 89, and it was hilarious because it's like everyone says 8 and then 9, or 80 plus 9.
Yeah, not the French 89. That's
Exactly.
always
It's like let's
getting my mind
let's
in
do
a
a
knot.
sum
Yeah.
whilst we're speaking. 4 20s and a 9, and the
Yeah, and
Danish
actually,
one.
I can make a case why I dropped the 10, because if you pronounce something in Italian, sometimes they only pronounce the last number. Well, no, that's a lame excuse. I try to make something up here.
We need to stop digging and bring it back to the history.
Yeah, could I bring in another argument why you could consider, after all, that the police state and the terror regime that came after the revolution were different?
You don't ever need any invitation from me, Beatrice. Go ahead.
No, it was kind of a rhetorical question. Sorry. No, the point is that you could discuss the question of the security state, which we are. You could discuss it in a more administrative, bureaucratic way, and just check whether in the ancient regime times there was always also a secret police in place with agents and the kind of practices that they conducted, and we've just established that they did. So this is the more administrative, bureaucratic level of discussing, making a comparison. But you could also ask the question about the legitimization, the constitutional framework in which the police state was embedded. So police state isn't just a state of random, brutal terror. It's police state kind of signals that the repression, that the terror is part of a system, is constitutionally legitimized. And that was something that started to develop after the French Revolution. And briefly about the term terror, this is also why I indeed am fond of studying concepts, intellectual concepts in history, intellectual history, because the term terror as such came to denounce completely different things after the revolution. Before 1789, before the 90s, more or less, you could find references in pamphlets and newspapers to terror as well. So the word terror did exist. And terror oftentimes also was connected to what the king did. But the interesting thing is that terror was oftentimes considered a benign instrument. It was the terror dei, the Timor Dei. It was derived from this biblical notion of the terror of the gods, so the terror of God, who would wield his sword to brandish and punish his enemies, and hail to the citizen, hail to the subject that lived in a country where this king wielded his sword to protect you. So terror was an instrument, a sword in the hands of the kings, given to that king by divine grace. So it was actually kind of a derivation of the divine power, power of the creation, the sublime power of the gods, and that was now resting in the hands of the king. So terreur had been part of the political vocabulary, but it delineated the righteous, the salutary, the majestic terror of God, to install fear in the enemies. And the victims of the terror were the enemies at the gates, the foreign armies or the invaders. And that changed during the times of the revolution. And with Robespierre's reign of terror, the concept morphed, and you can see that happening in pamphlets and newspapers. It became from a divine instrument a more secular sword. It became the terror of the people, the tyranny of the multitude. It became a term that could be used even to discredit political adversaries. So from the divine realm of things, the terror was now attached to plain humans. It became more mundane, and it was attached to the reign of terror in a completely secularized fashion. And for example, in the Netherlands, when the 1795, the stadholder left the country and a French regime was implemented, well, Dutch-French regime, the Batavian government, it was called the Batavian Terror. But the Batavian Terror was quite bloodless in the Netherlands. We didn't have guillotines or much like that. That's perhaps why I'm so interested in French and German and English history, for that matter. So the semantic field of terrorism shifted, and now became connected not just from the divine to the secular, it also became connected to revolution, to anarchy, to chaos, and to disorder. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that after 1794, 1795, terror was a new idea, an ideology that gave legitimation to the police state. So the police state was not now anymore just the ploy in the hands of the dynasty, the king's secret court police. It was now a police that had to enforce the terror of the people. And that's also why it became such a collective scare, and people were so outraged about this in outside the French borders, also within France, because it was now directed not just against concrete enemies of the king, but against whole categories, against priests, against noblemen, against émigrés. So I think that's important to make that distinction, that you can discuss terror on this more administrative, bureaucratic level, but you also need to have this discussion on the ideology, the idea of terror.
Mind blown. We have significantly rabbit holed at this stage, and I kind of want to keep rabbit holding, but I'm also trying to work out where we go from here. I'm going to be irritating and just double back a second to what you were saying about the assassination, let's call it the execution, of the Duc d'Enghien. I've probably ruined the pronunciation. We'll go with Beatrice's pronunciation over mine because she's a linguist and I'm not. For me, this is the moment where things start to particularly go sour with the Napoleonic regime. And then, of course, after that, you've got the creation of what is fundamentally a monarchy through the emperor system and the hereditary style that becomes adopted in the wake of that. And this sense, I think, for a lot of European powers, there's this sense of Napoleon's meant to represent a break from the old style of revolutionary government, right? 1799 is meant to be the end of the revolution, and so with that should go the apparatus, inverted commas, of the revolution, be it the guillotine, be it the terror, and so on. But that inclination to have, if you like, a rerun of 1792 is kind of a problem for other European states. There's this sort of sense, well, he's as bad as all the others that have been ruling in France during this period because he's using the same methods, he's doing the same things. But I wonder, is it worse because he violates not just that kind of sanctity of you don't chop a king's head off, even though Britain did it, and Britain I mean, let's just pause and acknowledge the hypocrisy of that for a moment here. So we beat the French to it by about 150 years, and yet when the French do it, we turn around and go, this is totally unacceptable, really, this sort of thing can't be tolerated anymore. So that hypocrisy aside, this sense that he's willing to do it, but that Napoleon, that is willing to do the same thing, but then also violates territorial sovereignty in order to do it. Okay, if you know the subsequent story of the Napoleonic Wars, you know that Napoleon doesn't have a huge amount of respect for territorial sovereignty. See Spain and Portugal. But nonetheless, the fact that he's prepared to do these things, does that mean that the concern, the fear, if you like, kind of goes up a level with the other European powers? Whereas there's this sense of, well, maybe you can do a deal with Napoleon because he's a bit different. Is there suddenly this sort of disquiet of, have we misjudged this guy?
Yes, although people like Metternich, for example, and the émigrés, of course, they were still trying to keep this conviction strong in the capitals of Europe and the courts of Europe, that he was basically cut of the same cloth. He was an armed Jacobin. And although there was this period between 1799 and 1804, where you could say, or perhaps even 1804, between 1806, you could argue that there was a relative calm and stability to the empire. Well, not really, but a bit perhaps in Europe, Western Europe. Still within the Napoleonic Empire, and even before it was an empire, during the consulate, there still was terror. And if we go back a little bit, for example, in 1801, there had just been an attempt to assassinate Napoleon himself, and only 3 weeks later he unleashed what was called the consular terror. And the consul, Napoleon, still consul then, he blamed radical Republicans for the machine infernale. So you already hear the terror ruminations here. And Napoleon wanted revenge. This is also what he said about the Duc d'Enghien. He was entitled to have his revenge because he was sure, and Fouché's spies had alluded that to him and told him so, that d'Enghien was up to no good against him. And he felt that he was completely entitled to do so. And he also felt, in order to terminate the reign of terror, the anarchy was a bad word at the time. There was a call for immediate reprisals against anarchists, the terrorists who still were attacking the nation in the person of its leader. So the assassination attempt on Napoleon was framed as an attempt to resort back to the revolution. So you can see here a kind of an escalation ladder, a radicalization process where the revolutionary terror gives birth to new waves of terror. And for example, Fouché already put up lists of dozens of deportees who had to either leave France or they were arrested, they were executed. So the vengeance was still there. So the consulate terror was less widespread and less indiscriminate than the terror under Robespierre. That was really indeed completely anarchistic, but there was still terror going on now, but in a more centralized fashion. But again, the other echo of the terror, and this is, again, I have to give him credit for that, Howard G. Brown, who wrote an excellent paper on this, and he makes the case that the echoes of the terrorism of the Robespierre regime are still present under Napoleon, because everything he does is for the salut public, and the peace, the harmony of the people, the health of the public. And that's exactly the same way in which the terror of the secular terror of the revolution was supported and legitimized. So you could say that there wasn't really a breach. It was just waves and echoes of the revolutionary terror that persisted and that were adopted by Napoleon himself. And even more so, he also reverted back to Louis XV. I'm putting it right here. The assassination attempt and the foreign, the secret agents by the court police that were dispatched to wipe out and to neutralize any political opponent. So it was there as well. I don't know if that makes sense. What I'm trying to do is this kind of paint a picture of more continuities, appropriation. Of course, there are breaches, and Napoleon himself is a breach, but he was already there before he became emperor. So, and his kind of centralized terror, security politics, you could say. Perhaps it was less terror; it was more authoritarian security politics. But his was also a police state, and a police state not in the sense like Robespierre had initiated and inaugurated it, in the sense that everyone had to ideologically bend to the fanatical ideas of the revolution. It was more police states in the sense that people had to be brought in line to support his war machine, to give their blood tax, the conscription. And any opponent, anyone who tried to persecute him or stage a coup or even a alleged coup attempt like the Duc d'Enghien against him had to be eradicated immediately. Here Napoleon is as radical as his predecessors.
I'm going to play devil's advocate in Napoleon's favour for a second, which is an odd feeling.
I never have expected you to do so, but go ahead.
I know that sound that everybody can hear is all of the Napoleonicist listeners falling off their chairs in shock at the fact that those words have just come out of my mouth. is Napoleon subjected to a terror of sorts himself through these assassination attempts, through the kind of so there's always this argument, isn't there, amongst the pro and anti-Napoleon camps about the extent to which the ancien regime powers, because that's fundamentally what we're dealing with in the other European nations at this time, were ever willing to accept the Bonaparte regime in terms of legitimacy as an organization that could be dealt with in the longer term. And from this, you get this kind of argument about, did Napoleon actually want peace and actually had war foisted upon him by the coalition powers? My views on that are well known. We'll park those for a moment. But that sense of he's subject to assassination attempts, there is this question of stability and legitimacy and recognition of his regime for quite a while. Sure, with the birth of his son in 1811, that thing kind of starts to change. This is why he's pursuing a marriage to any, really, I think would have done, into any royal house within Europe, again, to try and secure that legitimacy. But with that sort of that not being present for a significant part of his reign, and with these attempts on his life, and with rumors at least circulating about coup attempts, is Napoleon subjected to a form of terror?
Yes, no, and that's always one of the great dangers. If terror is unleashed, what is real and what's perceived, that the phantom terror, Adam Zamoyski calls it. And I think he overstates the phantom part as opposed to the real terror part. But for Napoleon, the phantom terror was very real, and several attempts on his life were committed, and assassination attempts carried out, and they failed. But the interesting thing is that inasmuch as he tries to end the revolutionary regime, because that is his ticket into office as consul, and he does try to make the repression and the terror, he does try to translate or morph the brutal terror, the random terror into a more predictable and a more centralized form of adjudication. For example, during the revolutionary regime, the Robespierre regime, you had these mobile commissions that carried out ad hoc executions, and then under Napoleon, special tribunals were installed, which was a marked improvement. There were still no juries, there were still no appeals, but there was at least now again a regular judicial procedure. And there were no whole blanket categories of emigre people, noble, widows of priests executed. It was rebels, bandits, armed robbers, people who were considered villains by most of the population, and also, of course, Napoleon's opponents who were put in front of the firing squad or guillotined. Guillotine was still there, of course. So the thing was that Napoleon tried to convince the population that the time of terror had now passed, and that he would now secure the liberties of the French. But in the name of security, and up against both the threat of the foreign invasions and internal civil war, he still worked with instruments of terror. The special tribunals still were special tribunals. There were still executions taking place. People were still being arrested. And increasingly after 1806, 1810, after the Continental blockade, he tried to enforce his reign of terror by spies, by people who had to arrest and apprehend not just brigands, but also people who were engaged in the black market, in smuggling. For example, in my hometown where I live, in Utrecht, there was a kind of a dungeon, a cachot. It was created explicitly for people who had not paid heed to the French directions. So it still was it was perhaps not a reign of terror, but it was a police state. It was a security regime. And in the name of the French liberties, everyone who was considered to stand in the way of these liberties, was removed by force, by executions, by arrests, by banishments. And this still was an echo of the original terror. And I'm not saying that Napoleon didn't have a case to make. Yes, he was beleaguered. He was attacked, but he was the one who escalated the level of terror even further. I mean, he was the one who started the wars. He was the one who went out of the French territory to kidnap the Duc d'Enghien. I mean, it's not that he stayed within the limits or tried to de-escalate the terror.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
For once, I'm not going to caveat that with any kind of Napoleon bashing, partly because I don't think any is necessary, quite frankly. You've done quite a remarkable job yourself. I want to talk about apparatus, if I can, and need and intent with this. And we've touched on this already in terms of aims and objectives, but things like state control of the media, use of the secret police, what's the end goal here? Why is there a need? Why does Napoleon feel a need to do this and to try and kind of shepherd popular opinion in a particular direction? Because this is the one we always talk about, right? The fact that the number of newspapers in Paris drops from something like 80 down to 4 over the course of his rule. This kind of effort to control what people are reading. Why the insecurity? Is this a kind of a sign of fragility or sort of paranoia within the Napoleonic regime? Because from the outside, I mean, look at what the guy achieves. You can't argue with the battlefield success. And you can't argue with the fact that with that battlefield success comes considerable wealth for the French nation in the short term, granted. So why the need to embark on this?
Oh, that's a really good question. And again, it's still not really settled. If we start, for example, with Fouché, Napoleon's minister of police, and Fouché was already Joseph Fouché. He was minister of police already in before Napoleon, and when Napoleon came into office, Napoleon at first wasn't quite decided upon the question where the Ministry of Police would fit in his overall scheme of government. And of course, he was always in need of accurate information, most particularly about military intelligence, about foreign powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria. And he knew that in order to wage his campaigns, in order to preemptively detect perhaps foreign invasions, foreign campaigns, l'esprit de public within these foreign countries, he needed to have his intelligence in place. That's for one what he needed. So he was a general after all, so he needed information to support his military campaigns. And the second thing is, we already discussed this before, he needed to thwart any attempt on his life, any attempt of the representative of the head of the new nation. So any plotting, any attempts of assassination needed to be uncovered in time. And that's also why he needed Fouché with his military police. If that in itself escalated into something more horrible, into something more pervasive, more ideological, there's still disunity amongst historians. I mean, how ideological was Napoleon really? Wasn't he just a general? Well, he did implement the civil code. He did implement the concordat with the Catholic Church. He did not go and persecute the priests anymore. So he did try to stabilize the country internally at some point, because of course he needed to have the support level high enough to support his military campaigns abroad and exerted taxes, of course. He could also have been more brutal with the people plotting against him. The Oprah plot, he could have executed all the people on the list of Fouché. He didn't do it. He banned them. He could have killed Madame de Staël, who was his arch enemy. He didn't. He banned her. So you see, he could have been more brutal. He wasn't. Why wasn't that so? Was he a moderate? No, not so. Not. I don't think so. He was a general, and he was very much aware. And I think that's also why he and Fouché worked together. They were both, in a sense, children of the revolution. Some people say Napoleon was an 18th century person. Yeah, perhaps, but he was also a product of the revolution, in the sense that he knew that even if you were a person without great standing, great wealth, and he wasn't, he was just from a minor nobility from Corsica, so he wasn't that famous, and he didn't have that positionality to become what he would become without the revolution and without l'esprit public, the spirit of the people. And he knew and I think, Zach, you also wrote about this, he was brilliant in mobilizing the masses, mobilizing his army, with the grand bulletins, rallying people around him, sowing all kinds of fake newses, just to convince the people that he was on his way to victory. So I still think, so my take would be that you have to consider the police state that Napoleon created, not as an end in itself, but as a means to support his military purposes. And I think that the bulletins of the Grande Armée are a case in point. And Fouché also supported, Fouché was kept in office by Napoleon in as much and as long as he supported Napoleon's military goals.
We could rabbit hole further, but you've mentioned the big name within this topic that we can't not explore, and that is, of course, Fouché. You can't talk secret police in France and not discuss the guy. You've talked about how he had this role within the revolutionary government prior to Napoleon's takeover. But what's his origin story? What's he doing pre-revolution?
Oh no, Fouché is really an interesting person. He studied and he wanted to become a teacher, and he was quite clever, and he worked at colleges, so he could also easily have been a professor or something like that. He knew Maximilien Robespierre, and then he was quite anti-clerical. It was anti the Catholic Church. But he came from a small village, but he came from quite wealthy family, and was often forgotten. He came from a bourgeois family who had huge plantations abroad, and not plantations. Sorry, they were quite involved in the slave trade. That's how his family got their monies, and interestingly, for Fouché was quite an ambivalent figure. So he was all for the de-Christianization movement, against the Catholic Church, against luxury and wealth. But on the other hand, he was the one who was in favor of keeping the slave trade in place. So didn't quite fit in there. And he was very enthusiastic about the revolution. He was, the blood of the criminals fertilizes the soil of liberty, is one of his citations. But then gradually he sees, he sort of morphs more in the direction of wanting to keep the order. So he sees that the anti-clerical, the anti-Christianization, the revolutionary energy unleashes all kinds of atrocities, but also brings about anarchy. And that's something that, and I think he and Napoleon are on a par on this. They don't like anarchy. They want to have some kind of stable political level of support. And he just wanted to keep the power himself, Fouché. Didn't want to be executed himself, obviously. And he even was, for example, he was briefly away in the Netherlands, safe and sound. And then when he came back in 1799, became Minister of Police to curb the excesses that the revolutionary agents had unleashed. So he had been one of the revolutionary excessive agents himself, but then gradually he felt that would upend his power base, and he became the instrument of keeping anarchy at bay. So he's very ambivalent. And he was a Freemason as well.
Why does he seem to be so good at this? Because this is the thing, right? That Fouché kind of props up Napoleon on occasion. Without somebody as competent as Fouché running secret police, there's very much this sense that Napoleon would have struggled in terms of kind of public, inverted commas, control. Is there any sense of him, why he had a particular talent for this role?
Yes, I think Fouché was the born intrigant. He was such a master of plotting, or a master of intriguing. I think we can hardly start to understand how capable and how widespread. He was like a spider in the web of all the news reports and the intelligence reports in France and even abroad. And he was very, very clever. And I looked into the files of Fouché in the last days of the French regime, 1813, 14, 15, and he was still plotting his way back then. So what he did, for example, is he collected, well, that we know that, but it's still, if you see that on your table, he had masses of dossiers, of files on every single person with some statue in France. He even collected dirt. What's the term again nowadays? Compromat. He was collecting compromat all along on any important figure of French public life, and on Napoleon himself as well. So everyone knew that Fouché could not be touched, because in his vault that was dynamite. So every file in itself was dynamite enough. And he was also very good in creating allegiances and in making friends, or at least so-called alleged friends. And he also was one of the inventors of the term, and I think I mentioned this before in other podcasts, but I love it so much, fausse nouvelle, fake news. And here comes the ideological element back in place. I told you before that the terror is an ideological idea, which was very much formative for the terror regime under Robespierre. And then Napoleon, it became more an instrument to keep Napoleon's military campaigns in power. But Fouché still had this ideological element to it. And what Fouché wanted to control was the esprit public. Because both knew, Napoleon and Fouché knew, that esprit public, the spirit of the masses, had unleashed the revolution. They had toppled a king before. They had put people under the guillotine. So l'esprit public is particularly dangerous if you are in power, and they knew that themselves very well. So what Fouché wanted to collect was everything, every single rumor, every single bad news, good news, fake news that was swiveling around the coffee shops. And you have to also bear in mind that since the 18th century, the coffee houses were an element of public life. Before that, even already in the UK, in Britain, and in the Netherlands, but in France as well. So people were going outside and they were sharing newspapers. The newspapers were laid out in these coffee shops, and for most people, subscription was too expensive, but they were sharing the newspapers in the cafe houses, reading about it, chattering away, drinking chocolate, which was considered quite an oppositional drink as well. And Fouché sent his spies into these coffee houses to collect the fake news reports in order to have his eye on the heart of the people, what was brewing in the capital. And of course, he was sowing the seeds of fake news himself as well. And he may have staged several plots and then thwarted them himself to make the case that he was such a great minister of police. So there's still enough to do research about it, Fouché. There's still lots of it in the dark.
So interesting. I love the kind of thing of, there's this plot, I've just thwarted it for you, but actually it was of my making. Like, I like the analogy of a spider and the web. What kind of reputation does he have in France? Is he one of these people that's sort of universally feared, and French children are told to be scared of Fouché, otherwise, this bogeyman is going to come and take you away? Or do ordinary French people just not even know that he exists because he's able to extract himself from the court? I mean, I say that, but those close to Napoleon obviously know that he exists, and there are these accusations that the reason that some generals particularly don't do particularly well is because Fouché doesn't like them. And so Fouché's got this agenda, and it's all Fouché's fault. So I'm just curious about whether or not there is this common knowledge about the guy and what he's doing.
Oh, that's well, I couldn't for sure now give a summary and an account of how Fouché is being perceived and what his legacy in France is. I think for the French, if you compare, for example, how a politician in the Netherlands or in Germany on the one hand or in France is considered, in the Netherlands and Germany, they would be more weighed and balanced against the principle of Gesinnungsethik. What were these guys' motives? What was he or she up to? Did they do something halfway decent? And in France, it's more the Verantwortungsethik. How did he do it? And Fouché was inevitably, he was one of the most canning politicians. He was one of the most intriguing persons there was. He was the perfect villain for any plot that you want to set up. And what a good comparison would be is compare him with Talleyrand, and this other one. And Talleyrand was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, equally long in office as Fouché had been, but Talleyrand never really got this imprint that he was a villain, that he was completely nihilistic. And Fouché, I think overall the perception of Fouché is more negative than for Talleyrand. So they were both considered windvaan. How do you say that in English? They turn their noses to every new wind that there's blowing. Turncoats. So he was considered a major turncoat, as was Talleyrand, because they were in service, at least Fouché was in service in the Revolution, then under Napoleon, as was Talleyrand, and then under Louis the 18th when he came back, and then again to Napoleon, and again to Louis the 18th. So it's unbelievable that they kept him in office and took him back. But they knew that Louis the 18th and even Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, advised Louis the 18th when he came back from Ghent to take Talleyrand and Fouché on board again, because they were running all the shows in France. You couldn't rule France without the two of them. They had all the portfolios on their table. But this didn't last long. Fouché and Talleyrand quit or were acquitted a couple months later, when the Paris Treaty, when the peace treaties were concluded, they weren't necessary anymore.
So interesting, isn't it? That this idea that, well, if you really want to run France, you need these guys. It just is a testament to how deeply embedded they become in the fabric of government of France during this period. If I can, I'd like to stay with the kind of the average person theme, because you were talking about, gathering in chocolate coffee houses and drinking chocolate and all the rest of it. How does the average person feel, in inverted commas, feel state control? Because this is obviously a very different age to the one where we kind of tend to think, or that we tend to think of when we think of secret police and state police, because there's that inclination to instantly associate that with fascist regimes, communist regimes, but those are 20th century products. There's 100 years in between what we associate most obviously with state control, Nazi regime, communist regime, and what's going on in the early 19th century. So what kind of impact does it have on people on a sort of day-to-day basis?
That's difficult to state, because the centralization was there, and the tendency and the ambition to keep l'esprit public under control in order to prevent new uprisings, new revolutions from taking place. So it was very centralized. And as I said, there were agents, and there was a secret police, an haute police, as it was called. So set apart from the normal police that just did deal with the mundane criminal affairs. But in as much as you weren't engaged in plotting against Napoleon, if you were not engaged in open opposition by means of the pen and the word, you could sort of avoid and steer clear from these effects of Napoleonic police state. So the thing is with Napoleon, as I said, well, he was very much in control of the army, of conscription, taxation, that needed to be in place. Anyone sabotaging that would have become a target of the secret police, and the people that were engaging in libels, as it was called, and Napoleonic regime, and I think that's what again gives it a continuity with both the ancient regime, but perhaps even with the revolutionary regime. It was occupied with controlling not just the behavior, but also the hearts and minds of the people, in as much as they gave vent to it. So unbridled individualism, which the revolution had evoked, could not longer be allowed. So people could not just write what they thought about. And that's why you have all these political caricatures, political pamphlets coming out of Britain, coming out of the Netherlands, and in some German states, but not in France. When the empire had been implemented, the educational machine, the printing world was very much bent on censorship. So formal censorship was implemented by the Ministry of the Interior, and they controlled all the books that were printed. And there were weekly reports that discussed which pamphlet, which newspaper, how the newspaper should be influenced, should be curtailed, should be prohibited. To the extent that Fouché ran a newspaper all by himself, as did Metternich, by the way, but from the Habsburgs, we know that they controlled everything, and the Prussians and the Russians. But the interesting thing is that in France, Napoleon also did away with the alleged civil liberties that were installed during the French Revolution, which did not have their full fling either under that time. But now under Napoleon, and especially after 1810, 1811, the last years of the Napoleonic reign, censorship was really very heavy, and many corrections were made. Again, there's research into this. Could you could you play the censorship, for example? Could you submit a manuscript and write it so cleverly that it wasn't really corrected? Well, sometimes you could, if you were clever enough, you could, but still, that there was a whole bureau, that was a whole ministry that devoted all its work to reading our manuscripts. I mean, if you would write an article, Zach, or write anything in the newspaper, it would be examined, it would be corrected, most probably it would be prohibited because it would be too libertarian, I don't know. And this affected the ordinary person, not any ordinary person, but a person dabbling in writing, being a teacher, a journalist, and there were lots of them in the French Empire. People were quite literate.
Can you imagine if that bureau had to edit the Napoleonicist, would get taken off the air? It just wouldn't be tolerable. It'd be completely impossible.
I think they would be it would be there standing knocking at your door right now.
Yeah, they probably are. Somebody just pulled up down the street. I should probably run. How you touched on this already, and this is one of the big things that I've tried to be very balanced in this podcast. Hopefully people will give me credit for that, and therefore forgive this one, because this is the big contradiction I have with Napoleon, right? He institutes a police state, and if you turn around and say this, people go, well, yeah, but so did all the other European monarchies during this period. And yes, that's absolutely right.
No, not all, not the Dutch.
Yeah, but the Dutch monarchy ends up being controlled in part.
Yeah,
that's
right.
a separate.
No, at that time, well, we're not discussing that time. Very sorry. It's 1813, 1814. Then the Dutch Constitution allows for free press, more or less, as does the British Constitution to some extent.
Yeah,
not
I mean,
there's but the common the system.
Yeah, I mean, there's the big one, which is that people still end up going to prison, don't they?
Yes.
For what's kind of construed as libel, but fundamentally it's just opposition to the British state. But there is this point that if you critique Napoleon for the institution of the police state, people will go, yeah, but other regimes within Europe are doing the same thing. And yes, they absolutely are, certainly from my understanding, but I'm not an expert on this. But therein lies the problem, because Napoleon's meant to be so much better than the other European monarchies,
Exactly.
and yet is using the same method. So I just want to probe into that and see where the truth of this lies, because how different is this from what's happening in other states in Europe?
Oh, I'm not sure if I know all the ins and outs and could come up now with a systematic comparison of the censorship in the Habsburg regime, Prussia, Russia, and France. That's quite a difficult question. It would make for a great article though. So what we know is that in Vienna, the Habsburg regime, the Habsburg Empire, in France, in Prussia and Russia, there were specific bureaus, ministries within the Ministry of the Interior that were completely devoted to control and read and assess every manuscript that was printed, and that they also had to submit to get how do you say that, licenses for printing the newspapers and the pamphlets that they wanted to print. And people were arrested, they were apprehended if they did not take heed for that. So we know that that was in place in all those authoritarian monarchies or empires. We also know that the thought, that the ideology behind the censorship, so what dictates the censorship, was different. And this is interesting, I think. And this is something that we could discuss further, because I haven't compared all the elements of censorship and control, but for the heads, for the Prussian and the Vienna and the Russian system of censorship, it was very much directed against identifying, taking stock, taking out of the public sphere of people that were writing libelous accounts on the heads of state. So it was very much the enemies of the dynasty, the people that were making ridicules of the kings and queens, the princes of those countries. They were taken out, and they were prosecuted for that, and the newspapers were being banned. But if you look in France, the question is it just the people that make a laughingstock of Napoleon? Is it just that? Is it just a kind of dynastic power politics again? Or is it more than that? And interestingly enough, that the manuscripts that were controlled in France, there's more ideology to it. So people who are too libertarian, people who complain about police tyranny, people who wanted to go back to the revolution, for example. So there's also more politics to it. But again, while I'm saying this, I think in Prussia or Vienna, it was quite difficult to make a case for a revolution or more democratic government either. So the radicals, as they were called, the radicals, revolutionaries, well, they were suppressed also by means of the censorship in all the countries alike. So you're right there. There's not so much differences there. Still, I think for Napoleon, it served his military purposes. It served his expansionist purposes. It also always had an eye on gathering intelligence on what the foreign enemies were up to, and an eye on how he could turn foreign enemies against each other. So there was always this war intelligence element to it, which wasn't there for the other countries. I think that's perhaps the main difference.
Another one I want to ask about is 1815. Quite obviously, we have the return from Elba, and this is often kind of touted as Napoleon's a reformed man. He's a different guy in 1814 to the one that he is when he returns in 1815. Is there any evidence of that when it comes to state control? Are we fundamentally looking at the same apparatus, the same methods, the same intent, or is there greater liberty in terms of how the Napoleonic regime runs itself? Do we see an end of terror under Napoleon with the return?
No, not really. I mean, Napoleon pretended that he would now come back to restore the peace again, and that he would ban slavery, and that he would be more serious about implementing civil liberties, but it was only 100 days, and it was quite a dynamic period, quite an anarchistic period also. And take, for example, Joseph Fouché. He was completely, I mean, he always had been unreliable. He was really very unreliable. He was behaving like a traitor from the perspective of Napoleon, because Fouché himself, as I said before, he was driven by this idea that control and keeping himself in Napoleon political power was important, but he was not really an idealist by that time anymore. He did it for personal gain. So what he did, Fouché, he swore loyalty to Napoleon, but he also promised the king's family, the Comte d'Artois, that he would take care of the monarchy. He was head of the police, but he played factions off against each other. And he had contact with Metternich all throughout the 100 days. He handed secrets to the Duke of Wellington, which is one of the reasons that Wellington wanted him to keep his office after 1815. So Fouché kept his spy network intact, but it wasn't of much use to Napoleon.
Interesting. One final one. We have to talk legacy, right? And you are the expert to do this with a book on fighting terror after Napoleon. How much of the Napoleonic model becomes a blueprint for the future of the conduct of the secret police and state control?
That's a good question. Well, you could argue that the haute police, this notion that there's now a secularized police that is not just supporting the king and his dynastic intrigues, but that the secret police is now supporting the new ideology of state. But that is not Napoleon's legacy, it's revolution's legacy. But Napoleon kind of forged these legacies together. So it's a mixed legacy coming from the ancient regime, getting new, imbued with all kinds of new, less secular meaning through the revolution. And then Napoleon brings in the centralization and hones it to become a real instrument for state-led intelligence, and intelligence that needs to be funneled into state policies, military policy, taxation policies. That's how Napoleon uses his secret police and tries to make Fouché bid his doings. And the legacy of that is, I think, the whole notion of haute police still survives after 1815 in the person of Fouché, in the person of the office of the police and political police as a concept is there to stay and never went away anymore. It was there in Austria and in Prussia as well, but that is what I try to delineate in my book. Fouché gives his knowledge and acts like a tutor for Justus von Gruner. And Gruner is the Prussian that's being brought in by Wellington and by Hardenberg, the Chancellor of Prussia, to Paris to run the Allied Army of Occupation's intelligence agents and the military intelligence agents in Paris for the Allied forces who are there for the coming 3 years to oversee the occupation of France. And Justus von Gruner discusses with Hardenberg, with Metternich, with Wellington, with all the main Allied powers, with the Russians. He discusses how they could profit from Fouché, how they could profit from all these channels and these agents that had collected fake news, fausse nouvelle before, and they're now putting it to their use after 1815. So there's an immediate, very concrete evidence that Fouché himself, his office, his agents, his spies, are all being copy-pasted into the new regimes. The same happens, and I studied this in the Netherlands in the archives myself, when the French regime, the Dutch were being incorporated, the Netherlands were incorporated in France the last 3 years between 1810 and 1813. So in 1813, the French Empire was pushed over the border. The Netherlands were liberated by the Russians mainly and by the British. And the first thing that King William I, who isn't king yet, but he's the sovereign prince, well, he does on the 28th of November 1813, that's when he lands on the beach of Scheveningen to reclaim his territory. He says, we'll keep all the police agents and all the security provisions in place, but we just swap the imperial for the royal. And he really does that. But then later on, a couple of years later, and the Ministry of Justice also remains the same in the Netherlands. It's Ministry of Justice Cornelis van Manen. He was already Justice Minister under the Batavian Republic after 1795, and he stays into office until 1840. It's the longest serving minister in the history of the Dutch countries. It's amazing. But this Van Manen also tries to keep the agents and the spies in place. He just wants to pay them less. And that's funny enough that you see that Napoleon was willing to pay, Fouché was willing to pay his spies abundant money. The Dutch were not so much. So that's where the Dutch spy work started to crumble a bit. So the question is also how much money, how much energy do you want to devote to such a secret police? And that's appetite for secret police wasn't that big in the Netherlands. They just had suffered under the French repressions. That's why they said, well, and King William later said, I do not want to have an haute police. We're not going to stick with that French invention, but I do want to keep my spies.
Beatrice, it's always fascinating having you on this show. You always knock it out the park. Folks, Fighting Terror After Napoleon, How Europe Became Secure After 1815 is available from Cambridge University Press. It's not, inverted commas, one of those academic titles with a price tag that's of many, many squillions of pounds. It's one of those affordable titles. You're going to want to go and buy it after this one. If you would like to hear Beatrice talk in person, and you happen to be somewhere in the south of England on the 18th of October, in the evening, Beatrice will be delivering the highly prestigious Wellington Lecture at the University of Southampton. So that's the evening of the 18th of October. I will put a link to the Eventbrite page in the show notes. It's a free event. All you need to do is book and you'll be able to attend. And there'll be some regulars actually from the Napoleon Assist there that evening to give Beatrice some moral support. Not that she needs moral support. She's going to knock it out of the park.
I do. I'm very happy with your support. Thank you, Zach.
Beatrice, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much. And please do come back again soon.
I will. Thank you very much.
A big thank you, as always, to my Patreon supporters, my Emperor-level patrons Mark Stoos, JC Kaiser, and Todd and Laird Campbell. My Marshall patrons, Matt Bone, Marcus Cribb, Roy Muir, Liam Telfer, Ger Brown, Graham Swidenbank, Colin Zimmerman, and duo Teixeira. My Commander patrons, John Haynes, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham, Andy Meakin, Michael Guest, and Ross Flowers. And my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rachel Stark, Noah Fink, Andrew Wright, David Maxwell, M. Duck, Anthony Gumbow, Chris Pramus, Mars Reedy, Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Bruins Girl, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, Indiana Fats, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Mark Anscombe, Rob Griffith, Ryan Diamond, Rob Coughlin, Mark Trowbridge, Nick Overland, Stephen Coulson, Graham Goodwin, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, and David Preece. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleon Assist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.